Okay, perfect. Well, since we are at the top of the hour, let's go ahead and get started with the webinar today. So welcome everyone to this next webinar in our series, talking about how to create and conduct powerful webinars that will wow your audience. And in our time together today, hopefully everyone will be able to walk away with some great ideas of how you can do exactly that. I'm going to start us off here by way of a little bit of an introduction. So happy to have all of you here today to talk about webinars. My name is Sheila Boyson. I am a professor here at Lewis University. I'm an executive leadership coach, a job search strategist, and then I think my newest actual kind of resume worthy title is that I am a circus ring leader as I try to work from home with my 3 kiddos and my husband, which I know is something that many of us are navigating our version of what our circuses look like. So here I can share with you the visual evidence of one of the days in my circus working from home. So whatever your circus looks like, I'm glad that you're here and you've kind of taken this opportunity to spend this time with us today talking about our topic of webinars, which it felt a little bit funny as I was putting together the webinar, talk about webinars. But because we're in so many webinars, I think that's tremendously relevant and actually is a perfect topic for us to focus on today. I would love to invite each of you, if you'd be up for it, in the chat. I know our room's getting a little bit full, so it's hard to have everyone connect voice by voice, but would love to have everyone take a moment to check in the chat, to say hello, tell us where you're calling or dialing in from, logging in from, share maybe what your current or your most recent role is, and what are you excited to learn about today as we dive into this content about webinars. So I will pause and let everyone navigate to that chat box just to share a little bit of a check-in. North Carolina, awesome. Leadership training, awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Good to have you here. And strategies for engagement, absolutely. We will make sure that is one of the things that we hit on today. Scott's looking for some new ideas. Awesome. Good to have you here, Scott. And Emily from Lewis University, engaging students online during this difficult time. So we're all looking to get a few more tricks up our sleeve, right? So engagement is definitely something we're getting some double clicking on here. Video as well. Thanks, Buffy. So glad to have you here. Yeah, absolutely, Paula. So I think so many can relate to that exact place that you're coming from, that you have done lots of presentations, facilitation, speaking, live events, but how do we transition that online? Very cool. Meaningful relationships, Maritza, great. So good to see you in here. Engaging web presentations for senior leaders. Cool, Rachel, that's awesome. Ah, Adrian, how much do you rely on slides versus video and talking? I love that. And we're going to address that. And specifically thinking about in the context, as a couple of you have already shared, you've got this down. You've been thinking about this from the perspective of, doing this in person and speaking engagements, but how do we translate that online? What do we need to shift and where do we need to pivot to be even more effective? A really great point. Michelle. Thanks, Marie. Absolutely. Some more double clicking there on the engagement piece. Content that sticks. I love that, Jenna. Keeping people engaged. So we definitely see a number of kind of consistent themes here, and all of these are fantastic. So we'll make sure that we hit on these as we move through our content. Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for checking in. If you haven't had a chance to finish that and hit send, go ahead and do that. Everyone loves to check that out as we move through the content today. We'll keep an eye on the chat. Okay, so to set the stage for the content that we're going to talk about today, my invitation to you, so to speak, is to think about what value you can actually provide to others. So let's actually start there and even just pause for a moment to think about this. How can you be of service to your peers, to your audience, to your clients, to your community? In other words, who can you help? And we have a very diverse group on the webinar. So this might look a little bit different for each of us. And it sounds like maybe there's some feedback. So hold on. Yeah, we're getting a little bit of feedback. So if you aren't already on, you could please mute yourself. And of course, if you have a question or want to come off mute to chat or ask something, not a problem at all. We would love to have you do that. But maybe just as our best practice here, we'll keep everyone on mute. Okay. There we go. Awesome. So hopefully we got that figured out. So I know in the room here, and as we hear everyone checking in, we definitely have a very diverse group on the webinar today. And this might look a little bit different for each of us as we think through these questions. But, you know, who can you help? How can you add value? So as you're reflecting on that, hold on to that for a minute, because we're definitely going to come back and revisit this. All right. So as we move into the meat of our content today, I want to share 3 reasons for you to stay until the end of our session today. First, I'm going to share a bonus strategy with everyone at the end of the webinar. And as we move through the full webinar, I'll actually share with you how I'm implementing a number of these strategies that we're going to be talking about. So you'll see what it looks like, and I'll call that out as we do that in the discussion. And then finally, the third reason is that webinars aren't going away. I think even after things go somewhat back to normal and we start settling into more opportunities to come back to face-to-face interaction, in-person events, there's going to be a much higher degree of comfort and appreciation for kind of this webinar virtual format. So I think we're still going to see plenty of this, and definitely more of it than we did before the current situation arose. So that's my third reason. So I guess I'll kind of point that out or signpost this as I go, that as you are conducting webinars, one of the things you want to make sure you do is kind of give people an incentive or a reason to stay for the whole thing. So you can see me kind of doing that here as I share with you the 3 reasons, and specifically that strategy of keeping one of the tips to the very end to share. All right, so in the chat function, I would love to have each of you tell me a little bit about, have you ever attended a webinar that you found to be a little bit challenging? Maybe it was kind of boring, or maybe you felt there was something that just made it feel not as well done. And what I'd love to have you do is tell me a little bit about what made it feel that way. Hopefully we don't have too many examples of this that we could all draw upon, but if you attended a webinar that just, it didn't hit the mark, it wasn't great, it wasn't compelling, what contributed to that? What made it not so great? Go ahead and share your ideas. Jeremy said it was a little robotic. The webinar presenter only spoke right off their slides, so kind of like reading slides. Maybe the content was too basic, Paula. Okay, it wasn't injecting something new and actionable. Emily said very monotone. Reminds me always like the, you know, Bueller. The questions at the end, that's an interesting one. So the questions at the end lasted as long as the presentation, with a lot of repeat questions. So there's kind of a management of the time and of the questions there. The tone was blah, disorganized, or not prepared. Ooh, the participants derailed the presenter. That's a challenging one. Didn't involve the audience, so didn't bring in that participation, that engagement, relying way too heavily on the slides and not interactive. Content wasn't diverse. Ooh, didn't start on time, Jeremy. That's one of my pet peeves too. I hear ya. Not too much engagement. Not too, okay, yeah, that balance, finding the right balance between content, engagement, interaction. What does that look like? And then most tech webinars are typically too deep in the woods, right? For some people, you're in tech, it's hard to keep people engaged. Or maybe technology problems happen. Absolutely. And full disclosure, we know technology problems happen to us all the time. So how do you kind of manage that in a way that it doesn't become a huge derailer in the process? Oh, fantastic. Well, this is really helpful to hear some of these things that we're talking about here that maybe have detracted from a webinar you've attended in the past. So what we'll do is we'll kind of talk through these different strategies that are going to address a number of these things that everybody's bringing up. So thanks so much for sharing your experience and your ideas. Tremendously helpful. So this is an overview of what we're going to cover today in talking about the strategies in our time together. So first, we're going to unpack the webinar thing a little bit. So what actually is a webinar? Why should we embrace them? And then we're going to dive into our strategies. So these are focusing on your content, being visually intentional, the structure, what does the structure actually look like, or what should that look like in a webinar context, how we can check in and how to do that often, and a little bit around that technology piece. How can we get that right? And then as promised, that bonus strategy will be in there as well for you. So let's dive in. So what is a webinar? A webinar, just kind of breaking it down in a really basic way, is an interactive online session, seminar, event that anyone with an internet connection and that necessary software can view on the web. And typically what happens is a host, a moderator, or a presenter is joined to kind of give a topic presentation to an audience. Best practices for webinars, and nobody mentioned this in any of their, maybe we got that a little bit with the Q&A being too long, but best practices is that a webinar should never go over an hour. So lots of research kind of shows that. But interestingly, some of the emerging research right now is showing that when we are operating from a state of being stressed, which probably many of us can agree that that is very much the climate with everything that's going on right now. We're all under more stress than we usually would be. Our attention span actually decreases when we're under a lot of stress. So before all of this happened, there was some research that was put out by LinkedIn that showed that the average amount of time that someone will stay on and watch a webinar, an hour-long webinar, is 54 minutes. So even though it's 60 minutes, people are jumping off at the end and abandoning it or coming in late. They're only staying for 54 minutes. And it would be really interesting to kind of resurrect that research and think about that even more in the context of what's actually going on right now, because I think what we might find is that attention spans are decreasing even more as people are operating from that place of stress. But a webinar can include things like video of the presenter who is hosting the webinar, slideshows, decks like this, different things like this, or other visual elements, maybe video. And it's usually followed by some type of Q&A session or an opportunity for questions to be asked throughout. So that, again, that interactivity and participation. So that's a little bit of an overview of, so what exactly constitutes a webinar? Kind of a broad definition and left a little bit open-ended intentionally, because there are a number of ways that this could be broken down and what this could look like. If we talk about what are actually some of the benefits and why we want to do this, one is that location flexibility, which is so tremendously important right now because we are limited. We can't be face-to-face in all those ways that we used to be able to be face-to-face. So we can be living in one part of the world and someone from a totally different part of the world could be attending, which is awesome with that flexibility. It also gives your audience a better chance of attending the webinar as opposed to physically attending a seminar or a conference or presentation where they might have to actually book a flight to get there or deal with other logistics, kind of planning it into their day. And then also webinars are really flexible in respect to their format. So the content can be recorded, it can be shared, it can be repurposed. And we'll talk a little bit about some different purposes that we can use when we're putting together webinars. On top of that flexibility, webinars also offer that power to really grab the attention of your audience. So that ability to create different mechanisms for engagement, as so many of you mentioned, and participation is tremendously important. And on top of that flexibility, we also want to kind of double click on the fact that there's that access. Someone's right there talking to you real time. and they can ask questions of you. You can answer them, you can address them. It's kind of cool to feel that connection, even if you aren't necessarily geographically right next to each other. So just to touch on a few of the things that really kind of highlight the benefits and why we should all be thinking about webinar. And as we move through this time together today, I've hit on this a little bit, but it's good to remind everyone, this is for you. This topic is absolutely for you. So please know that it is absolutely okay to throw a question in the chat function. I know my colleague Leslie's here today, and she's gonna try to help me manage the chat in case I miss anything, and she'll make sure she kind of points me to that. But please make sure to go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat, or of course, if you are feeling up to coming off mute, we'd love to hear your voice as well. And as questions come in, also feel free to respond to each other. So there's a wealth of knowledge in our attendees here today, just as I'm hoping you share some new information and valuable tips with you as well. I want to take a little bit of a pulse of the room. So I'm going to throw a poll up here. And what should happen in just a minute is this should show up for you. If someone can just acknowledge for me in the chat that they're seeing the poll there. Looks like you are, because you are able to click it. Have you ever personally hosted a webinar before? So tell me yes or no. Have you hosted a webinar before? The votes are coming in here. So it looks like we're somewhat split down the middle. And we've got, I'll see if I can share this with you so you can see it too. Is everybody able to see that? Our results are 57% of our attendees have hosted a webinar before, but we have 43% who have not hosted a webinar before. So it's great to have such a variety of different experience levels in the room today. So those of you who have hosted, please feel free to inject your ideas, tips, experience, and strategy into the conversation. And those of you who haven't hosted a webinar before, it is my sincere hope that by the time we finish today, you have some confidence and some excitement around jumping into that. All right, well, thanks everyone. I appreciate you sharing that. What is your biggest question or concern? Is there anything we haven't addressed yet? I know that we shared, here's some things that haven't worked really well in some of those webinars you've attended that maybe were a little bit challenging or a little bit painful. If there's anything that we haven't had a chance to kind of call out yet, feel free to pop that in the chat as far as anything that's your biggest question or your biggest concern when it comes to jumping into hosting an effective webinar yourself. Feel free to throw that in the chat as we go. Well, let's look at our first strategy. So strategy number one is all about your content. As we often hear, content is king. Mike's talking about backgrounds. Is that like slide deck, keynote, PowerPoint background type things, Mike? Let him tell me when he has a chance to type that. Yeah, let me know, Mike. And in some ways, the content can be really similar to what you would present in an in-person modality. That's definitely the case. But there's a number of different things that we want to kind of consider, tweak, transition compared to when we're doing an in-person presentation, facilitation, or keynote, and translate that to a webinar. So let's look at this a little bit more. First, selecting your topic. So I had already planted the seed in getting you guys to think about this a little bit, but how can you be of service? What does your audience need right now? What unique idea do you have? And what do you do or think differently than others who work in your industry, in your position, in your field? What is that expertise that you can kind of bring to the table? I always think about like the TEDx theme, right? Ideas worth sharing. And so I don't know if anyone's ever gone through the process of applying to be a TEDx speaker and how you have to really showcase your little piece of the world and how this is making a ding that doesn't exist before. So your idea there is you don't want to try to wrap your arms around anything that's too big. You want to find something that you're really passionate about, you're really excited about, and that's a transition or a departure, brand new from how other people have looked at it, to inject that new perspective. So let's keep thinking about this. And again, we're going to come back to this in just a minute, but I would love everyone to, at a minimum, walk away today with at least one idea. What's one idea of how you can be of service to others that might be a slightly different take, a different perspective, or a different lens to look through to address a topic, to meet a need? So as we think about what it is you want to be doing or how you want to accomplish this, one of the things that I know that I've heard in the past couple of years all the time is, everyone and their mother has a podcast, right? Now I think that's changing. We're going to start to hear, everyone and their mother has a webinar because everyone is trying to be really nimble and accommodating and move all these things that used to be face-to-face into this webinar format. So we're going to see even more of this. So what you want to do is make your topic really interesting and you want to mix it up. So as you design your webinar, you want to make sure that it provides a few different things. One, it's got to provide some type of learning. It's got to bring in a number of different activities or the engagement that you guys have already hit on so well. It provides multiple opportunities for connection and collaboration. And that connection, you don't want it to just be with you. It can be with each other too. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. And just make sure that you have that opportunity to collaborate in different ways. What we want to avoid is the massive content dump. So hopefully we're not doing that in person either when we're hosting in-person speaking events. But the urge to kind of check our news feeds while we're on a webinar, check our email, our social media is just a little bit too great when you're in the webinar. So you want to make sure that you are not just sharing a bunch of information, not finding ways to bring people in and engage them, whether that's visually, whether that's through activity or other avenues. If you want to know your attendees in kind of business development, in marketing, and in sales, one of the pieces of advice that are given to people is before you decide who your target market is, who your customer is, what your coach, I know we have a kind of coaches on the call today, your coaching specialty or your coaching niche, before you do that, one of the things you can almost do is design like an avatar of who is your ideal customer. And then anytime you're making a decision about your content or your business or your offerings, you always refer back to that person, that avatar, to make your decision. Does it meet their needs? And some of the questions you can answer to help you do that, even if you're not going to go through the process of actually building out an avatar, which is okay, is to think about these three questions. So who will be attending? What challenges are they currently dealing with or facing? And what are their goals and their aspirations? So knowing your attendees will ensure that you plan for a high level of value and therefore success in your webinar. Also, the title of your webinar is really important. You want it to be action-oriented and very clearly able to compel your audience to understand what they're going to gain, what they're going to be able to do after they attend that webinar. So I know for me as an academic, this is really important because by nature, I love data and research, and I need to save those lectures and those types of presentations for academic conferences. And in my webinars, I need to think about how or what action my attendees will be able to take immediately and apply towards reaching their specific goals. So a little bit of a pivot for some of us. Also, kind of keeping with the theme here, we can't just automatically or naturally or completely apples to apples translate what we were doing in person to online. I know I have an organization that I partner with often that will do kind of 2-day seminars. And now as they're looking to translate that to online, they can't put someone in a webinar for 7 hours each day, 2 days in a row. It's just not going to work. So for kind of an example there, we need to kind of think about when we're converting things to online, what logistically makes sense, what will keep the participants engaged and excited. And so you want to stay away from those 2 to 3 hour webinars. Break them into multiple sessions over days or weeks instead. And if you need to make them a little bit longer, absolutely make sure that you add breaks or even an intermission or some type of refresher or energizer activity that everyone can participate in virtually. So just a few ideas when you look to make that translation. All right, so as I promised, we were going to come back to these questions. Hopefully you've had a chance to think about these just a little bit more. And as we revisit these and you work on your kind of topic and idea to develop a fantastic webinar, I would love to hear any ideas that would be coming up for you. Or even better, feel free to come off mute if you want to type in the chat or come off mute, kind of even better, and share. What are some of your initial thoughts as you think of these questions? How can you be of service? What does your audience need right now? What unique perspective do you have? And what do you do or think differently than others in your field, in your industry, or in your line of work? I'd love to hear anyone's ideas, either in the chat or feel free to come off mute as well. I know we have a number of webinar veterans in the webinar today too, so you've already got some examples of fantastic webinars you've done and some that you have planned in the future as well.
Can you just
And how to incorporate work habits from staying at home into the new normal. I love that. So some unique perspective that you can kind of share and give there. That would be great. And Marisa says in a week she'll be hosting a bilingual webinar. Awesome. Oh, for recent grads and seniors preparing for the job market during these challenging times. So relevant, so important, and definitely to that point, Marisa, of meeting a huge need right now. I love that. Awesome. Good ideas so far. I might have heard someone come off mute. Did someone come off mute that wanted to share their idea? How parents can help high school students choose a motivating college major that leads to a satisfying career. Wow, that's an awesome, powerful, and helpful idea, Paula. I love that. Well, let's keep the ideas coming. We'll keep them in the chat and maybe everyone will be inspired as they have a chance to read them. Great. Interviewing virtually. Yes, they do. I think that is another example, Elizabeth, of something that even once we're back face to face, companies are going to have invested in that technology and first round interviews are going to start to become predominantly conducted only online. Adrian, not doing this now, but elementary teachers sharing tips on how to motivate and encourage children to want to learn. Yes, send that my way when you find it, Adrian. I love it. And transitioning from in-person training to virtual. Awesome ideas. I just love it. So much great kind of thought process going on here. So as you build out the content and build on some of these great ideas that you're brainstorming here today and work on your engaging webinar, there are a few things you want to kind of consider here. One, you want to have a clear outline of your content, and then you want to revisit it often and map out your framework first. So I usually do this in like a Word doc or a Google Doc. I make sure I capture my main points. I build in supporting details where I want to share examples or visuals or things like that. And I use color coding to do that. So that's my own kind of specific process, but happy to put it out there in case that would be valuable to anyone else. And you want to make sure you incorporate where you're going to bake in or build in interaction. So again, we're not just talking at people, but we're engaging them, we're collaborating with them, because that engagement is so important. And it's actually even more important in this virtual setting. So with your audience in a webinar, as opposed to even in-person events. And a big part of that is because in-person events, you can read body language, you can kind of assess those visual cues that you just don't have the same level of access to when we're operating virtually. The second transition is to abbreviate your stories and bottom line a little bit quicker. So anyone who's ever engaged in speaking training or worked with a speaking coach, you've probably heard and understand the importance of compelling stories to engage and draw in your audience, kind of a human behavior element of your speaking, of your presentations. That's still important to share stories in the context of your webinar, but you want to abbreviate them. You don't want them to be quite as long. You want to get to that bottom line a little bit quicker than you'd be doing in an in-person keynote, for example. And you want to shorten your audience activity time. So I know a number of you are sitting on some of my monthly ICF events, and you know that I love to use breakout rooms. And so when we do something like that in those virtual events, we give people, you know, maybe 5 minutes for an activity, where in person, when you're breaking people into groups in a room, you can give them 10 minutes, you can give them 15 minutes, but that doesn't translate the same online. So just to kind of give some ideas and some examples there. Oh, and Marie added another idea to the mix here. Marketing your services using Zoom to connect with clients. Cool idea. Love it. So bottom line is that you want to be really focused and start with what you want your attendees to walk away with. What's that bottom line takeaway? And then what is that tangible benefit, I guess would be another way to think about it. That tangible benefit that they'll receive beyond just receiving some great information from you. One example from the webinar that we're kind of going through today is what we just did. I wanted each of you to walk away with at least one value-added idea. So I actually threw the invitation out there and the questions to get you thinking and to share. So just one example of how that could actually be implemented. And then the last kind of piece around the content is the format. Consider your structure as you design your content. Be organized. And an example of a good structure would be to start with the situation or the problem that your audience is facing, or kind of that value, the why behind the content that's going to be covered, and to help answer upfront questions about why or what's in it for them. And then share your big idea or your strategies or your tips. And then what you want to end with is, what are the next steps? What should your audience actually go do with this information? If you are using your webinar, and again, I know we have a lot of coaches on the line who are looking to translate some of their in-person kind of sales funnel and marketing events to a webinar type of format. So if you're leveraging your webinar as a sales funnel in any way, the other thing to kind of recommend is at the very beginning, be really clear about that. So there's definitely a psychological safety element of people being told upfront. And those of you who have taken my sales course have heard me say this multiple times. I want to say it up front. At the end of this conversation, we're going to talk about if this is a good fit for you and if you want to move forward working with me as a coach. So it just takes that off the table where people aren't wondering, when are they going to sell me? So if in a webinar you are leveraging it as part of your sales funnel, which is a great use of a webinar, a specific type, but a great use of a webinar, you'd put your offer at the end, but upfront mention that you will be sharing that with them at the end. And only one offer. So if you have a business that have maybe 7 different ways that you support and add value for clients, in a webinar setting like this, choose one. We don't want to give people too many options. It starts to confuse people, and we go into that analysis paralysis. Strategy 2 is all about visuals, the visual elements of your presentation. So I know for me, and again, for many of my colleagues in academics, we have had the reputation of not always having the most compelling visual elements of our presentations. So I'm definitely going to own that. It's something I've tried to get much more intentional and learn more about and be better about it, but I'm still by no means perfect. I cringe when I go back and look at some of my past PowerPoints, actually. And then one of my colleagues gave a PowerPoint presentation yesterday, and she's had another example of just a great way to have a visually compelling and exciting PowerPoint. But that's part of the reason I get so excited to present and share a webinar like this, is because I don't want people to do what I used to do and make the mistakes that I used to make. So we need to work on upgrading the visual elements to upgrade the impact of our presentations. So let's explore a couple ideas of how we can do this. When it comes to webinars, you want to be consistent, and you want to try to align everything back to your specific brand or your specific tone. So for anyone on the webinar today who's looking to create webinars for your organization, you might want to consider branding it to your organization's brand specifications. If you are building it for your own business, I actually recommend go back to whoever designed your website. Maybe you've leaned on a graphic designer in the past. Make sure you save the codes for your color palette, and everything that you do, brand it out in your color palette. So for example, this presentation that I'm using today, all of the theme colors are using my coaching business brand colors. So you'll kind of see that throughout the presentation. And it starts to build that consistency and that representation. And then we want to upskill our PowerPoint, Keynote, Google Slide, whatever it is that you're using, acumen. So for those of you who aspire to or currently are using your own business or managing your own business, again, consider having a standard PowerPoint deck that you use every time you create any type of slides that represent your business. And as we're getting comfortable with PowerPoint, the thing is we often tend to lean on some of those default design templates. However, as we start to see more and more people getting comfortable in the virtual space and moving events, conferences, presentations online, those default designs might start to have the unintended impact of looking a little bit amateur or not as professional as we'd like them to look. And of course, that's not the case because what you're presenting is not amateur and it is very professional. So this is a great time to invest in a little bit of technical and professional development and play with how you can customize your slides to create an even more professional look. Once you create something that you like, make this your own personal template and keep using it over and over again. It actually will get to the point when people start to see it, they'll know it's yours because they'll recognize that brand. So I'm going to be totally transparent here and I'm going to share an example. So here's an example of what one of my old PowerPoints would look like. And, first, if this is what some of your PowerPoints look like right now, let's just pause for a moment and celebrate that you have PowerPoint slides and that you are taking the initiative to put something like that together. You've created them. That's awesome. We all need to start somewhere, and I recognize that. And we're all at different points and levels of comfort with the various different technologies and things like that. However, I want to just show you a little bit of a visual comparison of what this can look like. So this is a view of this presentation today using one of those standard PowerPoint designs and themes. So it might look a little bit familiar if you've seen it before. There's a lot of text there. There's not a lot of visual differentiation. It's not a lot of real interest. So again, that unintended impact is that we might lose engagement or there's nothing to really kind of keep the audience's attention. And that's what we want to avoid. We don't want to have that happen. And here I'm going to show you the slide sort of view of at least one iteration of what I'm sharing with you today. So what do you notice? What kind of looks different if you were to compare those two? What jumps out at you? Anything anyone's up for sharing? Color. Not every slide's the same color. Yep, I'm switching color a lot. In webinars, what will happen a lot of times is someone will look away from the screen for a minute. I'm sure none of you today are doing that, checking your email or the news or whatnot, but it happens. We're distracted by someone else in the house, etc. We look away from the screen for a second and we come back and look and we think, is that the same slide? Is that a different slide? Is it different? Did we move on? I can't tell. So if you actually are intentional about switching that slide, it's a very easy visual cue for people to know that. And it's branded using the colors I mentioned, and there's visual differentiation. For example, on any of my strategy slides, they're consistent. So strategy slide 1, strategy slide 2, those all look the same. So it's that visual psychological cue of, okay, now we're gonna cover this, or now it's a question slide, that type of a thing. And it might even only be perceived subconsciously, but it can create that consistency and that impact. The last kind of visual piece to talk about is that we need to keep mobile in mind. Not everyone, I'm sure we have perfect examples of this on the webinar today. Not everyone is going to be on a full large screen computer when they participate or attend your webinar. So you've got to keep that mobile in mind. Right now, the most recent study I could find shows that at least 25% of attendees tune into webinars on their mobile devices. I think that's actually probably skyrocketed more recently. And I think we're going to continue to see that trend carry forward. So when it comes to the actual webinar, make sure you increase the size of your text and the visuals so that it's really easy for people to see regardless of what modality they're using to access. So keep that mobile in mind. Let's take a look at strategy 3 then. All right, this is the one that I know sometimes people are like, hey, wait a minute, that sounds a little counterintuitive. This is more slides and more text, a little bit different, right? So you need to keep in mind that the pace is so important in a webinar. Keeping people engaged on a computer screen is different than in person. You might have the same slide up behind you in person at a keynote event for 5-7 minutes, and that can work really well. You want to stay away from that in a webinar setting to keep that attention. So for example, I have a signature talk that I do a lot in person. And as I'm saying this out loud to you all, I should follow my own advice and I should translate this online and start delivering it online during the current situation. So I'll add that to my to-do list after this today. But just to show you an example, when I'll put up a slide sort of view of my signature talk, and it's very visual in the sense that there's a lot of image here. There's actually not a lot of text here. It's much more image driven, which makes a ton of sense, again, in that face-to-face keynote. Very different than when you are online in a webinar like this. So a few things just to kind of think about, okay, what does the difference look like? How do I make the translation? So that's an example face-to-face. But again, I'm going to take you back to what I did today, and probably just an iteration of it, because I like to change things 5 million times till I actually use it. But here again is just that different. There is more text. I'm putting more text on there, more readability. There is the consistency with the color, a lot of use of color. It's not overly distracting with image. It's actually slightly more text-based than it is image-based. Absolutely. Okay. Good idea. Marie put a tip in the chat here about having someone actually test it on mobile before you go live. Cool idea. So a few reminders of some information to highlight here is use the same design for things like questions, or the same design for key points. Mix text slides with image slides. Fonts really matter, and font size matters, because of course you're going to have folks that are dialing in or connecting on mobile. And don't forget to use a little bit of humor in there. Finding a funny graphic is a great way to draw attention and add interest to your presentations. I'm going to go ahead and pause for a second as we've moved through those first 2 tips, and just to see where everybody's at. Any burning questions before we jump to our next strategy, number 4? Thanks, Marie. Marie says it's good, and she's taking some notes. Awesome. Well, let's do it then. Let's talk about strategy 4. So check in with your audience often. And Dee's just clarifying, did you say more text is needed in face-to-face? So Dee, great question to clarify. I'd actually recommend transitioning to more text and more slides when you're virtual, as opposed to having more image-driven, and it could be less slides when you're face-to-face. So it is a bit of a strategy shift, a really important point of clarification. Thank you. So just as Dee asked that question, and I put up a slide on there just to check in and see if anyone had questions. We used the polling, we used the chat, we have some folks coming off mute. It's so important to check in and to engage your audience. So I love, love, love this list. Someone who I admire immensely, her name is Carol Cox, and she owns a company called Speaking Your Brand. She's a speaking coach. She has these 10 tips, just ideas, not meant to be, an exhaustive list, and not meant to be something that you would integrate all 10 of these into your event, but some great things to get us thinking about how we can engage. Introduce in the chat. We did that today, right? There's too many people for each of us to take 60 seconds to introduce ourselves. Ask questions after you've explained something, just to check in and see where people are at. Ask questions that are short and easy to type, so things that aren't too long. Put the question on the slide, because how often does someone ask a question and you say, wait, what did they ask? What did they need you to do? So put it up on the slide. Ask attendees to share an example, kind of bring them in there to kind of share their personal experience. Encourage them to ask questions if they have them. Set up polls. Acknowledge attendees as they share. Use first names, things like that when you can. Allow questions to be asked by voice. If you can have people come off mute, that's another great way to have engagement. And get attendees to interact with each other, not just you. Absolutely. Awesome. Better engagement when you, absolutely, Jeremy. So encouraging people to engage with their video. I love that. So I know those are 10 tips, but I'd love to hear other things. Jeremy, you're beating me to it here by sharing your awesome idea. What are some ways that have worked well for you or that you're personally excited to try to engage your specific audience as you move into this webinar space? I'd love to hear your ideas, but always had better engagement when you use.
I've got one subtitle for one of your previous suggestions. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the easier you make it for someone to do what you want them to do, the more likely they are to do it. When you were talking about getting them involved with voice instead of, did you know that on Zoom you can mute your microphone, but just hold down the space bar to talk, and when you let go of the space bar, it goes back to mute.
I love that. The only reason I know that, Mike, is because I've heard you share it before. So such a good tip.
If you share that with your audience, they may be more inclined to just reach down and do it.
You're right.
Instead of having to unmute and mute and try to figure it out and make mistakes, things like that.
So
just a thought.
Make it as easy as possible for people to do what you want them to do. Such solid advice. And I guess that's also the same, you know, Jeremy brought up video and Mike brought up voice, giving people multiple modalities and not putting people on the spot, because some people might be super excited that they can log in, but they've got, you know, their little coworkers all around them, so they feel uncomfortable coming off mute or being on video. Just making sure you aren't forcing people to do it. But I love that. How can we make it as easy as possible to get people to engage in the way that you want them to? Solid advice. So my final official strategy is strategy number 5 around getting the technology right. So it is all about technology, and this was acknowledged as some of you just shared maybe some of the challenges you've experienced on webinars or witnessed before. And there are so many options when it comes to platforms. This is not an exhaustive list whatsoever. If you really are energized and super enthusiastic about the webinar thing, or if your organization is going to be doing a lot of webinars, these top 2 on here, Crowdcast and Zoom, with one caveat, are the 2 that I would recommend for webinars the most from my own personal experience. What we're using today is a Zoom professional account, so a paid account. But if you're really going to invest in the webinar thing, then you should invest in a Zoom webinar account. That is an upgraded version of the other paid versions, but has some fantastic functionality to really support you in that space of webinars. But we're seeing a lot of click meeting, Be Live, which is awesome for individuals that are looking to also stream to their business Facebook page. It's a great way to have that interconnectivity. And of course, we see a ton of WebEx as well as others, but just a few ideas.
My organization has banned Zoom.
Have they, Mike? Twitter just made that call the other day too. We're seeing a lot more of it as there are some security concerns, but it's been kind of fun to see and inspiring to see Zoom respond with so many great ways that they're trying to up that security. But yeah, you're not alone. So thank you for sharing that. Next is talking about being on camera, and we've seen a couple comments about this already. So if you are the one who's presenting, it is really important to try to have at least yourself be on camera. Of course, you can encourage others to be on camera, but there's something about that element of connection if they can see you while you're presenting. So don't forget the importance of something like that. And then ease your tech nerves. So maybe it's the first time you're using a platform, maybe it's going to be the first time you're putting on a webinar, and you are a little bit anxious about what exactly this is going to, look like, etc. So do a trial run, practice with someone. I'm sure you can definitely find a few people who'd be willing to be a guinea pig with you on the other side of that connection, just so you can have that comfort and that confidence as you head into your real webinar event. All right. Well, I mentioned that I did have one bonus strategy that I was going to share with everyone. I wanted to see, does anyone have any guesses on what this bonus strategy might be? And Adobe Connect was mentioned in the chat here, so absolutely. So many options for that online webinar platform, and so many things that different organizations and different companies are using. All right, I'm not seeing any guesses come through, so I might have you all stumped as to what this final strategy is going to be. Adrian said relax and have fun with it. I love that, Adrian. That's a fantastic strategy. So maybe we'll just say that we can Be vulnerable. I like that too. I like that too. And maybe it's encompassed in here a little bit. Rewarding participants with something. That sounds a little self-serving over there, Elizabeth. I like it. Unfortunately, that is not my tip, but I love the idea. The actual tip is to be yourself. So hopefully you're seeing me exemplify that today. Those of you who know me can tell me offline if you feel like that is representative of who I am. But give your audience a reason to stay till the end by being yourself, right? You want to make sure that you bring your energy, you bring your personality, and you let that shine through. Don't take yourself so seriously. If a little technological hitch happens, know that we've all been there. Work through it, laugh through it, acknowledge it, be vulnerable, as Adrian mentioned, so that could potentially fall into this as well. But being yourself and being authentic, absolutely. There's absolutely no better way to add connection and add value for someone than doing that. So that is my bonus tip. Try to mirror someone else's style. Jeremy said that was one of his biggest learnings, is that doesn't work that well. I hear ya. I totally get it. All right, so following through on my own best practices, what are your next steps? What do I want you to go do with this? I want you to pick a topic. I want you to create your content and then develop your offer if that's applicable. We did talk about how a lot of us might use things like webinars as part of our sales funnel. Set a date and then publicize it. I know that can feel a little bit scary the first few times you do it, but there's no better way to get good at this than going out and practicing it and doing it. All right. And then stay connected. So we are so excited to have this opportunity to provide value and connect with you through these series of webinars. As some of you might know, our department here at Lewis University offers a bachelor's degree in organizational leadership, as well as a full master's degree in organizational leadership. And these are specifically targeted towards the skills and the competencies that are most sought after by leaders within different companies and organizations. And we also have a number of graduate level certificates that are specifically aligned with industry needs for specific professions. And those include professional and executive coaching, which is accredited by the International Coach Federation to prepare you for your credential, as well as accredited by the Board Certified Coach Organization. Our training and development certificate and concentration within the degree, which is newly aligned to the Association of Talent Development, or ATD, to fully prepare you to achieve one of their 2 credentials that are sought after by industry, and then 2 other fantastic areas of study in higher education and student services, as well as organization management. So we would be so happy to send any of that information to you if you would like it. So with that, I'll go ahead and open up the floor for any questions that anyone has. I know that we're kind of bumping up against the bottom of the hour here, but just want to make sure that we have a chance to see if there's anything that we can address from a question standpoint. And then we have a comment: my biggest flaw has been trying to balance my authenticity with being professional. I feel as though I need to be strictly professional at times. I think that's such a good question. And I know I personally have let go of that a little bit. I've kind of found a way to know that my intention is to provide value and professionalism, but part of me being myself is not taking myself too seriously. So I try to, if I have to prioritize that, making sure that there's definitely some personality there. And then I like how Adrian shared a tip along the lines for those questions as well. If your style is to be more informal, go with it. And if you don't prefer to be all buttoned up in formal business attire, don't do it. Solid advice. And Rachel said, do you recommend using programs like Prezi? I know that the intention here wasn't to get too deep into the technology, but as I have kind of upskilled in the PowerPoint and slide space, and for my branding, which this isn't actually an official branded presentation, but I use PicMonkey to design all of my PowerPoint slides. And it allows you to have your custom color template in there, so you can change everything to your colors. So check out PicMonkey. There's a free version. There is also a paid version, and then that would be a competitor of another platform like Canva. So lots of options to research and play around with. You're welcome, Rachel. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Sheila. I have a question.
Yeah.
How are you?
Is that you, Marisa? I recognize
Yes.
your voice.
Yeah. It's Marisa.
So good. So good to hear you. Yes.
I have a question. So the webinar that we're hosting, it'll be a week from Saturday. I'm partnering with 2 other colleagues, and we're doing a panel discussion. We've invited alumni that have been through 9/11 and the housing market crash, that have gone through these experiences of they either graduated right before that happened, or they were new professionals around that time. My concern is that we have 1 or 2 too many panelists, and we don't have a slide. So it's, to me, for my style, it's a little bit organic.
Mhm.
So how could I find the balance in working with my colleagues? It's the first time that we partner on something, but I want to make sure that we have enough structure where the parents and the students don't feel confused, and that, but then there's also this freedom for them to interact and to ask questions.
Yeah, I think when we talk about moving things virtually, and this might be another example where it doesn't directly translate, in person, it feels a little more comfortable to have things be organic, and let it flow. And virtually, sometimes a little bit more structure can serve you really well. So maybe for something like a panel, having the structure piece built in up front, but then having a part of the time for the session dedicated to that organic question and answer.
Would you suggest that we do include a slide presentation?
I think especially for that structured piece, or sometimes even if you're worried that your panelists might go a little off track, having that visual cue to keep people on track can be really valuable.
Okay, thank you so much.
You got it. So good to hear you, lady.
It's good to hear you.
And then Dee said, has video worked for you when you've presented more times than not? Many times the presenter's surprised when the video does not work, and it can create stress. So Dee, my biggest piece of advice is to, 1, expect the unexpected, because there's absolutely been times that my video would not turn on. So I do always have the backup where I make sure that I have a headshot or a picture loaded in there. So if we run into that territory, at a bare minimum, they can at least see me and connect that way. But the biggest piece of advice is try not to stress over the technology. I know that's easier said than done, but we've all been there. We've all experienced it. So know that you're not alone. Your audience will genuinely be able to understand what that's like. They've had it happen too. Thanks for the question, Dee. All right. Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. So just a big thank you to everyone for taking time out of your day to spend this hour with us. I hope it was valuable, and stay connected to Lewis University and to organizational leadership. Thanks, everyone.